Way back in the 80s, when I was in my mid-20s, I was a passionate hiker and camper. I'm from Rhode Island, a state that's like a postage stamp compared to others. So I quickly exhausted all the local camping spots and longed for something wilder. I had heard a lot about the Appalachian Trail and how completing it was a badge of honor for many who shared my passion. My paternal uncle had hiked the entire trail over one summer in the 50s and talked about it constantly. He described it as a magical place, full of untouched wilderness just waiting to be discovered. I decided to embark on a similar journey. I couldn't take off an entire summer, but with good planning, I could hike the southern part of the trail from Harper's Ferry to Asheville, North Carolina in a couple of weeks. In the summer of 1989, I traveled to Harper's Ferry by bus and train, with all my hiking and camping gear on my back. After getting some last-minute supplies, I set off on the journey of a lifetime. The first few days were tough, but I quickly got used to the strain. I've never been as hungry and tired as I was during those first few nights in the Appalachians. I brought a hammock because I had heard scary stories about bugs in West Virginia. Nasty creatures like the assassin bug with its sharp, spiky mouth, or cow-killer ants whose sting is so painful it's said to have taken down a cow. It had to be a rumor, but it was intimidating nonetheless. Every night, after a long day of hiking, I'd get the hammock out of my pack, unroll it, and tie it between two trees to sleep. It wasn't the most comfortable sleep I'd ever had, but I wasn't complaining, especially if it kept the black widows off me. Since I was in the woods most nights without a shelter, every little hoot or squawk from nocturnal animals would wake me up. It was annoying, but I considered it part of the experience of being in nature. One night, I woke up to the sound of rustling leaves. I heard something moving close to me. I shifted in my hammock and looked over my shoulder. My blood ran cold as I saw a huge, dark figure looming over me. For a moment, I froze as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I realized it was a person, just standing there, motionless, staring at me. In one fluid motion, I rolled out of my hammock and ran off into the woods. I didn't care who it was. Anyone who does something like that doesn't have good intentions, and I wasn't about to stick around for a chat. I ran a safe distance into the woods to catch my breath. Then I started to sneak back toward my camp. I wanted to make sure it was clear before I grabbed my stuff and moved to a safer spot. I moved slowly, scanning the darkness for any sign of the shadowy figure. I eventually got back to my camp and found it completely deserted. All my gear seemed untouched. I had a horrible gut feeling that whoever had been standing there had just retreated to watch me from a distance. They were waiting for me to come back for my stuff so they could ambush me. If they weren't there to steal from me, they clearly wanted something else, and I dreaded to think what that was. Nevertheless, I managed to grab my gear and leave the area without anyone sneaking up on me. For the next few days, I hiked hard and fast, exhausting myself in an attempt to get as far away from that area as possible. I thought I was safe. No one had bothered me during the previous few days of hiking, so I figured I'd be okay from then on. But I was wrong. Terribly wrong. Every single night since that incident, I had trouble sleeping. I kept picturing that person standing there, just staring at me in the dark. I had no idea how long they had been there or what they had planned for me. I was just glad I got away. I didn't start to feel safe again until I bought some fishing line from a sporting goods store in one of the small towns I passed through. I used it to make tripwires, which I strung between the trees around where I was camping. I hung a couple of empty bean cans on the line, so anyone who snagged their foot would make the cans clatter, alerting me to their presence. I had one big scare when a fox snagged the line. I rolled out of my hammock with a knife in hand, ready for whoever was creeping up on me, only to see the furry little guy scurrying away in the moonlight. I ended up laughing to myself about that one, and after that, I stopped sleeping with my knife in hand because one little slip could have gotten me into a world of trouble. About a week passed, and I had finally started to get over the shadowy figure incident. I must have been almost 100 miles away from where it had happened. I had no trouble at all on any of the other nights besides the incident with the fantastic Mr. Fox, who scared the life out of me. With the help of my little fishing line alarm, I started being able to get to sleep without any trouble again. But that night, I woke up suddenly and found that I couldn't move properly. I couldn't bring my arms up, and the material from the hammock seemed to be pushed right into my face. I was cocooned in it, as if the fabric was wrapped around my entire body. This had just registered in my half-awake brain when I heard the sound of fabric snapping, and then boom, I hit the dirt, completely knocking the wind out of me. I had no idea what was going on. I struggled to break out of the hammock, but I couldn't. Then I felt the hammock being dragged across the forest floor. It hit me. Whoever was dragging me had bundled me up in my own hammock with some kind of cord, cut the ropes tying me to the tree, and was now dragging me off to who knows where. I screamed at the top of my lungs for whoever it was to let me out, but no one responded. All I could hear was the sound of the hammock's fabric rustling against the forest floor. I knew I had to think fast, or whatever was happening wouldn't end well. As I said, I had stopped sleeping with my knife in my hand or nearby in my hammock because that was just an accident waiting to happen. So I had absolutely nothing handy to cut through the material and escape, or so I thought. Suddenly, an idea came to me. A few years back, my dad had gifted me his old wristwatch. It was a reliable thing, but I had one complaint. The little latch that kept it tied to my wrist was worn with age and was actually a little sharp from years of use. I had accidentally poked myself a few times with it, and one time it actually drew blood. I knew what I had to do. I unbuckled the watch as quickly as I could, which wasn't easy since I was being dragged along the ground in pitch darkness. Pinching the sharp clasp between my thumb and index finger was even harder, but I managed it. When I did, I started to scrape it against the fabric of the hammock. It was just as effective as cutting canvas as it was at cutting skin, and although it took a good few tries, it didn't take long until I could see the subtle glow of the silvery moonlight from the other side. I kept cutting as quickly and quietly as I could, until there were so many cuts that I could rip myself out of the canvas cocoon like some terrified newborn bursting out of a womb. You'll have to excuse the analogy, but in retrospect, that's exactly what it feels like happened. I was born again that night. I got a second chance at living. Escaping that hammock meant life, because I know that staying in it would have meant death. For the second time in about 10 days, I found myself running through the dark woods, only this time, the terror I felt dwarfed what I had felt the first time around. I don't even know how I managed to escape, assuming it was the same figure from the first night. They had somehow managed to track me for over 100 miles and sneak past my tripwires. They were a far better woodsman than me, and probably more physically fit too. All I know is, by the time I reached a house with its lights on, I turned to look behind me as I was banging on the door. There was no one else around. The family who lived there were kind enough to put me up for the night after I called the local sheriff. He came out in the morning to help me retrace my steps through the woods. We found my camp, but not the hammock. And although I told him everything in excruciating detail, I could tell he was skeptical of my story. He even suggested that I had gotten lost and frightened in the dark, and had just ended up jumping at shadows, or maybe had a bad dream that seemed a little too vivid because of the lack of proper rest. But I knew it was real. I could feel it in the way my palms were sweating as I told him. I am certain that night really happened the way I remember it. I never did finish that dream hike. The next day, I caught a bus back toward Harper's Ferry and then took the train all the way back to Providence. I only ever told a handful of people what happened on the trails. I figured not many would really believe me. They'd just think I was telling a campfire tale or something. I didn't tell my hiking uncle for the longest time. I thought he would just gloat or whatever, and tell me that I didn't have what it took to do something that tough. But when I finally did share my story, I got a reaction that I definitely wasn't expecting. He just nodded and told me that he had some nights when he didn't think he'd make it out alive either. He told me that there are people who live up in those mountains, who have been outlaws for generations, who live outside of society, outside of the natural order of things. He'd had some pretty close calls himself at times, bumping into people who weren't nearly as friendly as the majority of West Virginians, and sometimes seeing things that he knew he wasn't supposed to see. But he didn't want to say just what those things were. I always told myself that I'd try my little Appalachian adventure another time, maybe when I'm a little older, a little wiser, and when I've got something a little bitter to defend myself with. The trail will still be there, waiting for me. But then again, so might whoever tried to drag me off that night.